So my title is What Can a Martial Body Do for Society? And it's actually a title that might sound ever so slightly peculiar to some ears. And this is because it has a familiar structure, but it seems to presume knowledge of something that's quite obscure or unclear. Two things, in fact. First, a martial body, but what is one of those? And second, society. What is that? And their relation. We don't yet know what these enigmatic things may be, yet because we recognize the words and the syntax, it has a familiar structure. The question, what can this or that do for society, is very familiar. It's the kind of question that's been asked by philosophers, moral entrepreneurs, and social engineers of all sorts throughout the ages, and it remains a staple question of many kinds of debate in all sorts of context. Just think of mainstream tabloid or television or radio programs that involve guests and audience debates, phone-ins and arguments in response to a tabloid or headline issue of the day. Such programs pick up on a phenomenon and ask whether it's good or bad, right or wrong, whether it benefits or is harmful to society, and so on. So the structure of my title is familiar. What can a martial body do for society? Yet what might be meant by the familiar-sounding term martial body? It could mean any number of different things to any number of different people. The same goes for society. Despite its familiarity, it could have a number of different conceptualizations and configurations and mean different things in different configurations. Given this, it would seem to me that a good response to such semiotic openness or instability would be to examine the consequences of such semiotic openness itself as a key part of the question. However, it strikes me that the more widespread scholarly response to semiotic openness and instability is not to embrace it, but in more or less knee-jerk ways to seek to define and impose meanings so as to eradicate or banish predicative instability in order to try to be clear. And this is understandable. But one problem is that such definitions often give short shrift to the ways that the terms actually circulate and function in the discourses of the everyday lives of the people who use the terms out there in the world. And this seems problematic if we are indeed interested in the things as they exist out there, rather than as they might be made to seem to exist within a scholarly discourse. Furthermore, the scramble for definitions also gives short shrift to the vitally important moment or stage of scholarly, academic, analytical, or indeed scientific questioning. I've talked about this before. In German, everything is scientific, but in English, scientific means sciences, hard science, so we tend not to say, like, I'm not doing science here, I'm not a scientist. Maybe if I was in German, then I would be a scientist. The kind of uncertainty that should arise when we observe a condition of semiotic instability, plurality, multiplicity, heterogeneity, contradictoriness, and so on, and when we're faced with the question of how to proceed in the face of it or what to do about it. So I want to be clear at the outset that I appreciate all efforts to be clear, but I want to emphasize, indeed exaggerate, the importance of the moment of non-clarity and uncertainty. And I want to pause to consider this moment so that we may ultimately be able to find some other things to do at the start of martial arts studies analyses than rush into the construction of our own definitions as if there were nothing better that we could or should be doing. I'm speaking hyperbolically, of course, for clarity. Indeed, perhaps clarity is an effect that always requires a dimension of hyperbole, caricature, or maybe even polemic. So this is a kind of polemic, to be clear. Questioning and defining attitudes are definitely valuable. I definitely believe that academics should not simply talk about things as if we already know and understand clearly what they are. So no one should simply say martial body, for instance, and then enter into a big argument about the martial body and society without explaining what this, indeed what either of the terms is meant to mean or what either term is supposed to be. That would neither be very academic nor very scholarly. And if there's one thing that I hope we can all assume we're being at the moment, it's scholarly or academic, at least for the duration of this conference. So in my discussion here today, I will be pausing to consider and question certain meanings. However, to be clear, this will not be in order to construct tighter or more rigorous definitions and meanings. Rather, it will first be in order to begin to problematize and deconstruct some easy-to-make assumptions, especially some that are made by academic orientations, including assumptions about the act of defining. Yet I will be doing this not in order to try to wreak havoc or destroy the value or validity of any academic work on martial arts and society, but rather to try to contribute something that might help to enrich the field, if only by emphasizing the ineradicable dimensions not only of plurality, heterogeneity and multiplicity, but also of the undecidability that permeates the definitions, not only of things like martial arts and society, but also of presumed or possible relations between such things. Indeed, perhaps we should be pleased that we may never really be able to settle definitively the matter of what martial arts means. Perhaps this is enabling. And perhaps we should embrace the fact that we may never really be able to agree on what society means either. Indeed, whether either of these presumed things really exist, in what ways they may be said to exist, and what the full or fundamental dimensions of what their relationships with each other might be, or if indeed the existence of either of these things could ever be said to be more than relational. So it's with relationality that I want to begin. Can an identity ever be said to be anything other than relational? As Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe argued quite convincingly in the 1980s, because identities are purely relational, there is no identity which can be fully constituted. Almost 2 decades later, in his arguments with Slavoj Žižek about politics and society, Laclau was still making the same arguments. In response to Žižek's now infamous and what Laclau always regarded as ill-thought-through adoption of a kind of crude Marxist and quick Leninist position on the question of how to make radical political changes in the world, Laclau argued that we gain very little once identities are conceived as complexly articulated collective wills by referring them through simple designations such as classes, ethnic groups, and so on, which are at best names for transient points of stabilization. The really important task is to understand the logics of their constitution and dissolution, as well as the formal determinations of the spaces in which they interrelate. Laclau pitched his argument in terms of the vocabulary and concerns of post-structuralist and post-Marxist political theory, whose essential proposition runs like this. Because everything, and by everything what Laclau means is everything, can be seen as contingent and hence conventional, then therefore everything is to be regarded as irreducibly political. There's much that can be said about this argument. I myself wrote a PhD and then a couple of books about it, and I evidently still can't get away from it. But I return to it here because I believe it is vital and vitalizing to try, as Laclau urges us, to understand the logics of the constitution and dissolution of entities and identities, as well as the formal or informal determinations of the spaces in which they interrelate. This is important because, for Laclau, identities are to be understood as complexly articulated collective wills, which is why he believes that we should not be content with the moment of referring them through simple designations such as classes, ethnic groups, and so on, because such terms are at best names for transient points of stabilization. Some of you may be wondering how any of this relates to the concerns of this conference, whose title is, after all, Martial Arts and Society, on the societal relevance of martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense. I believe that it has a direct bearing on our concerns because Laclau's perspective challenges us to think about the making or establishment of any identity. This is rather different from thinking about the academic definition of any activity, entity, or identity. Indeed, although Laclau's argument here includes the injunction that academics be rigorous and forensic in their conceptual grasp of their key terms, it is not limited to this injunction. Equally, it's not merely about problematizing and trying to reconfigure and refine the definitions and distinctions that we may use in our work. Rather, for Laclau, and indeed for the overwhelming majority of works of cultural theory developed through and since the 1980s, the fundamental point to be taken on board is not that we should work out how best to define something. It is rather that we must face up to the fact that things are neither simply nor necessarily things, that all identities are at root contingent discursive achievements or establishments, or, to use Leclau's words, transient points of stabilization. This has at least two dimensions, an in-here dimension, so to speak, and an out-there dimension. Our shared use of a term like martial arts stabilizes our discourse in here, the academic world. But it can also impose and project a fixed view, our present view, of all sorts of dimensions of culture and society, both backwards in time and outwards across different linguistic, geographical, cultural, religious, and social contexts. So the establishment of a shared and stable term has its benefits, predication and communication being one of them, and reciprocally, perhaps, the constitution of a society or community of communicators. But it inevitably also comes at a cost, which we might render in a number of ways, including projection, simplification, hypostatization, generalization, transformation, or even cultural, conceptual, or linguistic imperialism, and so on. As in, we say martial arts in English here today, but did or do this say or mean anything like there, elsewhere, or then, elsewhen, without difference or remainder? And are we misrecognizing the things out there and then that we talk about in our terms here and now? These are all huge problematics related to the in-here dimension of stabilization. The out-there dimensions of stabilizations are the same, albeit in inverted and displaced ways. As very quick examples, consider how frequently it is currently said that mindfulness meditation has been practiced within Eastern meditative traditions and martial arts for millennia. That's what we're saying now, it's mindfulness. Or before that, Qigong, or elsewhere people say yoga, millennia of yoga, millennia of Qigong, millennia of mindfulness. Such propositions are all based on acts of fantasy and projection back into a fantasized notion of long, long ago. And such acts of projection are not just ideas. As Louis Althusser taught us, ideology is principally material. This is why, on a tour I was given during a visit to the new Mecca of Taekwondo in South Korea, the Taekwondo one, our guide pointed to a picture of an old statue and said, "Look, this is a statue of someone doing Taekwondo. That posture comes from Taekwondo." The fact that Taekwondo was only invented in the 1950s and that its patterns, or kata, were only subsequently changed from the Japanese martial arts from which it is derived seems to problematize the idea that an ancient statue may be depicting a Taekwondo posture. The possibility that the Taekwondo posture might have been invented deliberately to depict the ancient statue in order to strengthen the ideological claim that Taekwondo is ancient was not really welcome at all. There is much that such examples invite us to ponder. They're extremely suggestive. But here I just want to introduce the point that even within the English language, even within the present moment, however defined or circumscribed, even a passing encounter with the range of practices that self-identify and self-organize in terms of one or another idea of martial arts reveals myriad, multiple, legion, heterogeneous practices and discourses. Theoretically, I'm revisiting some broadly post-structuralist points briefly, all too briefly, here, because I believe that remembering and taking into consideration these lessons in our various ongoing research projects into martial arts and the international development of the field of martial arts studies will allow us to move on from our current fixation on definitions. For rather than orientating and habituating us into an academic life of taxonomical labor centered on defining and demarcating, post-structuralist approaches proceed from the proposition that identities are always irreducibly relational and incomplete, and hence contingent and open or ongoing. Identities are constituted by and within discourses, and they always emerge in points in clusters of moving constellations of related, contiguous, cognate, differentiated, associated, contrasting, and oppositional terms in all kinds of possible relations: linguistic, semiotic, lived, institutional, legislative, and so on. Our current conference's title itself demonstrates dimensions of this. Martial Arts and Society, on the societal relevance of martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense. This title sets up the relation between martial arts and society as one of externality. Martial arts and society are presented as different, and then sets up the question of the relevance of the former for the latter, in terms of the latter, as if martial arts must make a case for itself or themselves, pleading their innocence and their value and bidding for acceptance or admission into society, as if society were something like an exclusive club, like Plato's version of an ideal republic. But then the subtitle switches from the macro and quickly moves into some fine internal differentiations. So as well as martial arts, we are now also confronted with something different from martial arts called combat sports, and something different again called self-defense. These are internal differentiations that emerge within and because of a certain configuration of the kaleidoscope of the twists and turns of discourses of martial arts and everything around them that feeds into, arises out of, is part of, supplementary to, adjacent, abutting, or slipping and sliding into and around what we are here and now designating martial arts. Such differentiations as those between martial arts, combat sports, self-defense, and others have not always and everywhere been in existence. These putatively different entities that we can all happily distinguish between and discuss here and now, today and tomorrow, and in the pages of contemporary websites and publications, are neither timeless nor natural, nor indeed even necessary. They are entirely contextual, conjunctural, and discursive, and we can look at how such identities have emerged and ask questions, as Leclau puts it, of their emergence, constitution, and stabilization, including questions of the place and role of academic discourses and their definitions and demarcations in these processes. The issue of the kinds of questions we feel inclined, entitled, able, or even obliged or duty-bound to ask about our object of study is an interesting and surely significant matter. As thinkers as different as Noam Chomsky, Jacques Derrida, and Louis Wacquant, among many others, have noted in their very different ways, some questions are terrible. Certainly all questions should be held up for interrogation before being used to organize or orientate any quest for knowledge. As Derrida once noted, the very form of a question always overdetermines the possible character of the answer to it. Approaching the orbit of martial arts studies, Wacquant once discussed at length the ways that some academics come to explore questions that have been formulated along the lines of political or business interests. And much closer to home, Adam Frank has detailed the hugely ideological questions that Chinese scholars have to pose, as if scientifically, about the health benefits of Tai Chi and Qigong in China. All the questions in the studies of Qigong and Tai Chi in China are about how good it is for you. No one ever asks, does Tai Chi give you cancer? You know, that wouldn't be allowed to be posed within that discursive context. Even when a question strikes us as a good question, it's still important to interrogate why it seems good or valuable or urgent or important. On this occasion, we're all responding to the question implied, almost explicitly posed by the conference title. As you know, my own first response to the conference took the form of the possibly clear or possibly very cryptic question, what can a martial body do for society? It sounds clear, but of course we still don't quite know what a martial body is. Is it even a thing? My sense is that within the communicative context opened up or indeed stabilized by the recent emergence and increasing stability of the language games of the field of martial arts studies, the notion of a martial body could easily be postulated and elaborated and could easily gain traction. We could easily start talking about the martial body. The notion of the martial body could easily become a discursive trope in its own right within the field. Of course, it isn't yet, but the point is there may be no reason why not. This is because a formulation like the or a martial body actually seems overdetermined by and imminent to the current discursive and conceptual conjuncture of the field. At the very least, I felt able to choose or invent the term martial body as part of my title because it evoked several different interacting things at once. Several different dimensions feel distilled into it. in condensation and displacement, in much the same way that Freud argued different dimensions are distilled into dreams in condensation and displacement, and in the same way that scholars of film, media, and cultural studies have since argued that a range of different dimensions are distilled into film, media, and cultural texts in condensation and displacement. That is to say, a few different things were on my mind when I dreamt up the title. It didn't just emerge from no reason, from nowhere. The first dimension echoed is that of this conference's title itself, Martial Arts and Society, on the societal relevance of martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense. Read against this backdrop, my title hints at giving some kind of answer to the implied question or questions harbored in the conference title. What is or are the relationship or relationships of martial arts to society, and presumably contemporary society at that? What is the relevance of martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense to society or societies? The second dimension distilled into my title came from my most reading at that and thinking in the field. At that time, the title suggested itself to me. I had been reading Ben Spatz's 2015 book, What a Body Can Do. The key allusion in Spatz's own title, and what is most distilled into the words, what a body can do, is the famous question of the philosopher Spinoza, what can a body do? Spatz displaces Spinoza's philosophical question about what a body can do firmly into the social field and into questions of furthering knowledge of embodied knowledge by pursuing research into bodily technique. So from the question of the relevance of martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense to society, I thought immediately of martial arts as a bodily practice. This too seems overdetermined. Do we ever say martial arts and not refer to embodied practices? And therefore, to the question of the martial artist's body, or even a massed body of such bodies, and its or their possible relations to and with or within society. And as I'm sure you could all already anticipate, much as I did when I first thought of the title, such possible relations are likely to be multiple, heterogeneous, and often simultaneously contradictory. At different times and in different places, whatever we may either vaguely evoke or precisely define and designate as martial arts could have as many different relations to society as anything else we may either vaguely evoke or precisely define. Martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense are themselves relatively floating and dilatory signifiers, although, as I say, they have been strongly tied to the notion of the body. But this could conceivably change, even if it's unlikely anytime soon. Some people, whether academic, practitioner, or otherwise, would characterize one or other of these terms as being a subset of one or another of them. Others would prefer to separate out these three terms and fence them off from each other. Some would regard them as being in porous and promiscuous relationships with each other. Others would argue that they are utterly different realms. Many have tried to define and demarcate. Some of these are academics who may believe themselves to be disinterested. Others, whether academic or not, have tried to define and demarcate martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense for more obviously interested reasons, whether that be arguing for the superiority of one style over another, or one category over another, or advertising, maybe even inventing their own style, and so on. There are lots of different kinds of bodies and societies that are interested in defining and demarcating martial arts bodies and societies. On the one hand, academic bodies or academic societies, and on the other hand, institutional bodies or institutional societies of many kinds: martial, sportive, healthist, spiritualist, self-defense, and more. So there's always a drift and condensation and displacement going on. We think through and with inherited terms, and hence conceptual differentials and differentiations that we are more or less compelled to work with and within. But as Ferdinand de Saussure taught us, when we are thinking about our linguistically instituted categories, first and foremost we must remember that there are only differences without positive terms. Moreover, as Jacques Derrida went on to point out, there are no easily specifiable or simply stable referents behind these differences. The flip side of signification is force. There is no stability in signification without force. Furthermore, as Gayatri Spivak added, the institution of any difference in the production of an identity and discourse, the drawing of any demarcation that distinguishes and hierarchizes entities and identities, is essentially and irreducibly a political act with more or less overtly political consequences. Such post-structuralists formulate all of this in terms of violence. This means that if we follow this logic through to one of its conclusions, it could become possible to argue that more or less any identity is in some sense martial. It has either been fought for or fought against, and it's therefore in some sense both a body and in some sense a society, or some part society made up of bodies that is or are part of a larger interacting body that we call society, stabilized but conflictual. So there are convolutions here and concatenations in which one thing folds into another thing. Yet conceptually we are still on a very familiar plane or axis, with bodies at one end and society at the other, in which bodies make up societies and societies produce bodies. The problem with this kind of thinking, however, are several. First of all, as our already quoted post-structuralist political theorists Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe pointed out in the 1980s, for instance, society is not a datum, but a construct. In other words, we can only ever evoke society. We cannot put our finger on any one thing that is society. Society only ever exists in its discursive evocations, in its mode or manner of representational construction or composition. Then at the other end of the spectrum, the same problem applies to bodies, or worse, the body. For as scholars such as Spatz and others have noted, once we institute the notion of the body as the disciplinary object of our attention, we hypostatize it as an it, a unitary knowable thing, and thereby presume its existence and its stable, predictable knowability. This can actually facilitate the paradoxical situation in which the very object of our focus can become a blind spot and something that we don't look into, so to speak. Of course, once again, I am erring on the side of hyperbole here for reasons of clarity. The point is, society is a floating signifier, as is martial arts, as is the body. Now, although in the 1980s and 1990s, post-structuralist theory chose for strategic reasons to emphasize the negative via notions of lack, constitutive incompletion, open-endedness, the barred subject, misrecognition, shift, drift, slippage, deferral, structural dislocation, and so on, it is possible to propose that there is no fundamental reason why we might not now be able to take on board all of the caveats and precautions found in post-structuralism, all of its alerts about the subtle and complex matters of ethics and politics in the face of alterity and the contingency of discourse and so on, and nonetheless go on to accentuate the positive. So we can note that even floating signifiers are captured and stabilized in numerous ways, like balloons filled with helium that can still be anchored down to something, even if they bob and float about. As I have suggested, perhaps the key anchor, or what Laclau, following Lacan, would call point de capitaine, in discourses about martial arts, boils down to the body, or rather a range of contingent, conventional, motivated, or interested constructions of the body. Certainly the notion of the body has an overdetermined relation as both foundation and keystone, point de capitaine, quilting point, or anchor. The body is always implied as a mediator. This is so even though a long and powerful line of thought from Sun Tzu's The Art of War through to Chris Hablegray's Postmodern War and beyond all but ignores the individual body and focuses only on all of the other technical, technological, tactical, logistical, strategic, political, and ideological arts of warcraft. Yet when we evoke martial arts today, the term all but always implies the body. We should pause to reflect on this contemporary configuration of meaning. Has the term martial arts really always referred to the body? Or is this a false universal? That false sense of eternality that Althusser regarded as the very definition of an ideological view? Of course, we might nonetheless note that even in works that seem to take a far broader view of the martial, the body is not entirely absent. It is always strongly implied. And if there is always reference to a martial body when martial arts are evoked, then we might inquire into the forms that the martial body takes. I suggest this because, for a range of reasons, I would propose that studies of the figures of what we might call the martial body as they emerge and circulate in different discursive contexts would be extremely rewarding. And to refer back to my earlier polemic, I'd say that they would be more worthwhile in martial arts studies than the production of any more definitional lists and hierarchies of what supposedly is and what supposedly is not a martial art. For if we were to pick out the contour lines of the discursive figures, configurations, and representations of martial bodies in different contexts, then we would be able to reflect on how these constructions reflect back on or illuminate the contexts in which they were produced. Or put differently, such textual analyses might help us glean more about the ideological contexts and discourses within which the texts and figures have been produced, much more so than dreaming up and trading in disputations around definitions. Figures and figurations of the martial body will be multiple, yet they might not turn out to be all that numerous. They would vary from place to place, but I think they would certainly all include the following familiar figures and forms. First, perhaps, the Oriental of Western Orientalism. Then the soldier of many, perhaps all, cultures. Also the underdog, a staple of Hollywood, of course. Then the wanderer, or am I still being too influenced by Hollywood and 1970s TV series? Because I'm thinking, obviously, this is my wanderer here. Not very... This is David Carradine. I guess this is my Oriental here as well. I mean, not particularly Oriental. This is my first, introduction to Asian martial arts, being through American television programs and films. So we've got our wanderer and so on and so on. We also have the woman, from Yim Wing Chun to Buffy the Vampire Slayer and beyond, and then the warrior monk, a figure that's been much appropriated in Western Orientalist texts and discourses, but who is not exclusive to them, and is also popular in Eastern cultural texts and discourses. We also have the gangster, whether triad, yakuza, mafia, or generic hard man, and a cluster of intermingling figures that might be called the Shaolin Ninja Jedi Superman, along with the cousin species, the superhero, such as Deadpool, my current, possibly all-time favorite martial artist now is Deadpool. Where am I up to? Deadpool. Super. There's also, of course, the competitor, ideally the Olympic athlete, the bodybuilder. I'll show this. This is for Sixth Wetzler's benefit. Oh, bless him. The evil genius that is Jean-Claude Van Damme. The bodybuilder, at least in the modern Western imaginary, the martial body has long been connected with athleticism, which itself has even longer been connected with often impossible images of mesomorphism. Then conversely, the flip side of the hyper-visible martial body, the invisible man or woman, the surprising, unexpected expert who has skill without physical markings, the master of pure technique rather than hypertrophy. There's also another figure that interests me quite a lot, the Janus-faced figure of the martial artist who amounts to a kind of psychiatric patient in waiting. I'm thinking here of the troubled or damaged figure. The troubled or damaged figure who needs the therapy of pugilistic training to be saved. Think of a figure like Robert Downey Jr., who was saved from his descent into drug and alcohol demise, whatever, by Wing Chun. At the same time, or on the opposite face of the Janus mask, we also have the supposedly serene hippie, New Ager, or modern mindfulness practitioner, moving and meditating via Tai Chi and Qigong, but whose need for such practices ultimately suggests the presence of a previous or underlying problem that needed the therapeutic treatment of internal or external martial arts. I reflect much more fully on all of this stuff about martial arts as therapy in this book, which should be out next month. For the purposes of this conference, the figures of this first draft of my hurriedly compiled list might be clustered into three groups. First, people in films, then the person of moral fibre, then the degenerate. Such groups seem apt to conclude or summarize the list, encompassing as they do, first, media or representational simulacra, second, a figure of supposed social improvement, and third, a supposed agent of social decay. And if the figure of the martial body can encompass such a range, then it's possible to see quite easily that it would be possible to pose and test many hypotheses about martial arts as socially righteous and or socially deleterious, and come up with any number of possible conclusions. A point to consider here, then, is that actual textual or empirical studies in and of themselves may be unlikely to settle any matter or issue of societal relevance decisively in and of itself. And this conference asks us specifically to think of the relevance of martial arts to, or for, or in society. As mentioned earlier, this seems like a good question, but as I suggested earlier, perhaps we should pause to consider why it seems like a good question. Has it always been a good question? Will it always be a good question? It will definitely not be long before we forget the seeming eternity that has recently started to pass, in which people asked each other, will martial arts ever be a valid object of academic attention? Do you remember that question? Do you remember it? It would be asked. For many years, it was asked as if the very idea was preposterous. But look at us now. Yet perhaps we're already forgetting how often and with how much sincerity the question was asked. We are forgetting because we now have a mushrooming array of conferences and books and journals and even degree courses dedicated to martial arts as a valid object of academic attention. Yet let's think about the fact that not very long ago at all, to devote yourself to the academic study of martial arts could easily have been to commit an act of what my friend Sixt Wetzler once termed career suicide. But today, it's quite possible to be promoted to the very top of academia by focusing on the field. Nonetheless, the notions of martial arts do still struggle with certain stigmas in the academic world. They are still stigmatized as being trivial, sometimes childish, other times mad, usually boyish or heteronormative, and overwhelmingly irrelevant. The subject is easily deemed trivial and irrelevant because martial arts do not seem to connect obviously to the uber-legitimizing architectonic of knowledge that is politics. Martial arts are sometimes hastily deemed to be not obviously political enough to be self-evidently important to the fields of the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Perhaps this is why so much academic work on martial arts has organized itself so heavily around political questions. Indeed, if we were to try to sum up how scholarship has assessed what a martial body can do for society, I would propose that our literature review would be likely to discover that what has most exercised serious scholars is what we might call the political dimensions subtending them. Obviously, this is not politics proper, although martial arts have connected with proper politics many times, in many places, in many ways. But rather, I mean political in the more Heideggerian sense of being shown to be complexly contingent and irreducibly ideologically, ethico-politically accented and inflected. Some of the main ways that martial arts scholarship has been elaborated include the following. First, in terms of questions of nationalism. Benedict Anderson argued that in the modern world it is nigh on impossible for us to think of the world outside of national and nationalist categories. Studies of martial arts have time and again revealed the sometimes blatant, sometimes subtle, but always tangible connections between martial arts and nationalism. Second, and closely related, is the area studies approach, which connects martial arts styles with regions and often goes on to construct regions via a tacit equation between nation and ethnicity. Third is the class paradigm. Martial arts have been studied in relation to class. Yet again, as classes are perhaps always constructed as national rather than neutrally socio-economic, their connections with nationalist and ethnic matters has never been far away. So a focus on class cannot be unplugged from matters of the nation, nor can it be dissociated from gender. And gender-focused paradigms are increasingly well represented in scholarship. There are also significant approaches organized by ideas of religion, ritual, and political economy. The intermingling of these kinds of approach and the emergence or development of different perspectives and viewpoints has also produced works that might be characterized as organized by post-colonialist and multiculturalist paradigms too. Viewed from here, the question of the social or societal relevance of martial arts seems like a bit of an open goal. we can easily show how relevant martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense are for society, at the same time as thereby showing how relevant we are within that society. And these are both important processes. Showing how our object of study is relevant to society legitimizes it in the face of any public interrogation or audit. Such legitimization of our object or field reciprocally legitimates us. I've written about this and what I take to be the important matter of the dual or double focus of any and every academic approach in my 2015 book, Martial Arts Studies Disrupting Disciplinary Boundaries, so I will not labour the point here. Instead, here and now, I want to conclude by making some comments and suggestions about how to relate to or deal with the issue of definition that I've mentioned a few times here today, and that has recently taken off as a problem or pseudo-problem within martial arts studies. As I've said, I'm dissatisfied with the rush to define. At the same time, however, I think that the growing prominence of the matter of definition does attest to a lot that is promising in the current state of martial arts studies. It's definitely a reflection of the drive to found and ground and legitimate the field rigorously and according to proper academic protocols. To this extent, our current moment is of great significance, and we should be extremely happy. However, to my mind, it seems that in the current rush to try to define and establish things clearly, there is a risk that we are labouring under certain misapprehensions. These misapprehensions could come to constitute an obstacle or impediment in the development of the field. Stated bluntly, it strikes me that the field is currently struggling with a bad case of what Paul de Man once called the resistance to theory. In the case of our field, I think this takes the form of much current thinking proceeding in terms of what the theorist Slavoj Žižek once termed naive empiricism or naive cognitivism, or even what Jacques Derrida decades earlier referred to as incompetent and even irresponsible empiricism. What such thinkers mean in making claims like empiricism is naive and or incompetent is that there is a kind of untenable idealism and simplicity at the heart of approaches which begin from the premise that to make sense of the world, we should simply look round us, focus on things, classify them and count them, and that through a process of testing and disputing around categories, we might eventually get at the truth of reality and get it right. The more or less opposite opinion is essentially shared in common by thinkers as divergent as Žižek and Derrida and many other post-structuralists, namely that, on the contrary, what we all always need is an explicit theory. I say explicit and not just theory, because I firmly believe that everyone has a theory, they just don't necessarily know what it is. This is why it's so common for people who are arguing with each other to challenge the other person's argument in terms of what they perceive as the weakness or misapprehension of its viewpoint, position, or in other words, its underlying theory, its assumptions about the way things are and how things work. Obviously, I'm sure we could all agree that there is an obligation for academics to be self-reflexive and self-aware about their own viewpoint, position, premises, hypotheses, and so on. My contention is that this points in the direction of theory. Nonetheless, it still seems to be the case that a lot of martial arts studies work currently lacks any clear sense of its own guiding and orientating theory. By theory here, I'm referring to anything from an overarching ontology to an actively thought-through image or sense, to use Laclau's terms again, of how discourses and identities are constituted and the logics of their processes of establishment, stabilization, interaction, transformation, and dissolution. So yes, I am arguing for more theory, an injection of theory, and the permeation of theory before definition, but I'm not proposing a return to the intellectual battles of the 1980s and 1990s, in which the introduction of continental philosophy into the humanities led to a state of trench warfare between those who did continental theory and those who did analytical theory, or those who did theory and those who did empirical work. One might hope that we might have come to terms with both impulses and moved into a dialectical synthesis of such supposed opposites by now, or at least a hybrid third space or something like that, depending on how we theorize and verify change and development. Furthermore, although I am arguing for theory, I want to be clear that I'm certainly not therefore arguing against empirical work, or history, or reality, or anything like that. Moreover, I would not follow either Zizek or Derrida or anyone else who might ever position capital T theory or capital P philosophy as the start or end point of any academic work on martial arts. It could be if you wanted it to be, but I wouldn't go there. But I do want to insist that it will be vital and vitalizing for all work in martial arts studies to embrace certain aspects of cultural theory, especially when we are, as in the current moment, faced with the apparent need to do something that so many people seem to believe is to define our objects and our field. For faced with the apparent challenge of needing to define, as we have already seen, with even the tiniest bit of theory, we're able to pause to reflect on the fact that before definition, there is relation. Words and meanings and practices and values travel and twist and turn and change and move in relation to larger and other forces and processes. So martial arts will always be relationally determined. Laclau and Mouffe theorized this in terms of discourse and articulation. Stuart Hall insisted on the need to establish a sense of what he called the conjuncture. Any analysis requires what Hall called conjunctural analysis. This is an analysis informed by an awareness of the historical moment and context and the forces and relations that produced it. Without this, we cannot really know or understand anything about any entity or identity, such as martial arts, combat sports, or self-defense. Of course, there may be many ways to characterize and analyze a conjuncture, and as deconstruction sought to teach us, no context is ever fully closed, so we might never know for sure that we know for sure anything about a context or a conjuncture. Maybe, therefore, we can't really know for sure that we know anything at all for sure. Yet what we can do is attempt to assess a context in terms of forces and relations, relative weights and gravities, and the ways in which forces and fields constitute, color and condition entities, identities, and practices. In Britain, Raymond Williams long ago proposed that it is possible to formulate and look at entities, practices, and identities, and to assess them in terms of whether they are dominant, residual, or emergent, and to ask whether they may be acting in ways that are either in line with a dominant or hegemonic ideology, or whether they may be alternative or even oppositional to it. This may seem like quite an old and quite a crude paradigm, but even with something as simple as this, Williams provides us with a viable and flexible framework through which many different kinds of studies of martial arts and society might be initiated, all happily liberated from the stifling imperative to define and demarcate without any real sense or sensitivity to the complexities of matters of time, place, and the interplay of forces that both produce and transform meanings, practices, and contexts. Thus, to conclude, if we quickly consider a deliciously marginal or problematic example, like Tai Chi Chuan, for instance, we may be able to reconfigure discourse and debate about it away from a sclerotic fixation on the question of whether it can even be defined as a martial art, or combat sport, or self-defense, or form of what we now insist on calling mindfulness meditation, etc., and into an understanding of what it has been and has done and might be and might do in a given conjuncture. Note again the way that we now see mindfulness everywhere, from meditation in modern America to martial arts in ancient China, even though even a few years ago we wouldn't have seen anything as mindfulness anywhere, because no one apart from a few specialists were using the term. Anyway, as Douglas Weiler's argued, Tai Chi Chuan emerged as a discursive foment in which China was threatened ideologically, economically, and politically. Its 19th century proponents elaborate that its philosophy along obscurely yet imminently nationalist lines, so that Tai Chi Chuan came to stand in stark opposition to any and all things Western or European. In this process, residual Taoist ideas and principles were mixed into a growing alternative worldview that was oppositional to everything supposedly non-Chinese. This is also precisely why Maoism tolerated Tai Chi Chuan, of course, and why it survived the Cultural Revolution. It amounted, in its elaboration, to a collective, combined, non-Western, non-competitive, non-individualistic calisthenics avowedly rooted in a non-religious worldview. But of course, this was survival via a formalization that amounted, therefore, to a mutation on a genetic level. So in a sense, post-Mao, The term Tai Chi Chuan essentially had a transformed meaning, referring to a transformed practice. In this sense, in that context, whether we think it was a martial art or a mass ritualized socio-political symptom, Tai Chi Chuan was essentially relevant to society. But notice that here, by society, we actually mean ideology. In its journey to the West, as we know, in the Western imaginary, Tai Chi Chuan was ostensibly deracinated from any nationalistic inflection or valence and became articulated to a range of open-ended discursive configurations or conjunctures, from the counterculture to New Age ideology and onwards into therapeutic and even medical culture. This is a frame from Easy Rider, which is the first cinematic appearance of Tai Chi, sort of, improvised Tai Chi form in America. In all this, it becomes differently relevant to society at different times and places. And of course, the words relevant and society have different meanings in each instance too. Mixed in with all this is the fact that any of those involved in Tai Chi Chuan in any of its different times and places will believe themselves to be either or both learning a martial art, either or both for sport or for self-defense, and or involved in healthful calisthenics, and or preserving or changing a culture, and or involved in a religious or mystical practice, and so on. We can multiply our examples and look at the ways in which certain words and moves have drifted and disseminated and flipped and mutated all over the place around the world through time and space, and examine the process of their emergence and development within each new context. The ways they become mixed up and mixed in with existing concerns and outlooks, and reciprocally modify and move existing situations. I've mainly referred to the theoretical models of people like Ernesto Laclau, Jacques Derrida, Stuart Hall, and Raymond Williams here. I've also used Slavoj Žižek, but mainly as a kind of uki. And I've done so mainly because I believe that there is, more or less, a kind of theoretical ontology that connects their outlooks, despite their many other differences. This outlook is essentially post-structuralist or post-foundationalist. And as much as many people still have a distaste for so-called high theory, I maintain that martial arts studies will only benefit from a sustained engagement with what there is to be learned from high theory, as much as there is to be learned from engaging with the most intimate ethnography, the most detailed historiography, the most multi-layered sociology, and so on. Some of the first lessons relevant to us here would relate to an awareness of the slippage and vicissitudes of signification that require us to pay very close attention to the shifting and drifting apparent reference of our focus, their different meanings in different times and places, the genetic mutations and quantum leaps that occur in cultural translation from one time to another, one place to another, one language to another, even one utterance or instance to the next, and the rather frustrating fact that despite our eternal desire to see unity and simplicity, cultures and practices are always in bits, always in process, in completion, dispute and contestation. There is no unity to any dimension of the terms martial arts, combat sports, self-defense, or society, apart from that which seems to be conferred by the use of the terms themselves, in much the same way that speaking of unicorns, or fairies, or justice, or Father Christmas, or the nation, or madness, or such like, can create a reality effect that can lead people to believe that these are actually existing, real, and unitary things. All meanings, all practices are stabilizations. The question is why these stabilizations, in these ways. As Derrida once protested, all that a deconstructive point of view tries to show is that since convention, institutions, and consensus are stabilizations, sometimes stabilizations of great duration, sometimes micro-stabilizations, this means that they are stabilizations of something essentially unstable and chaotic. It is thus it becomes necessary to stabilize precisely because stability is not natural. It is because there is instability that stabilization becomes necessary. It is because there is chaos that there is a need for stability. So perhaps an alternative or oppositional line of questioning into and of or for our martial body, however stabilized, might be a line that asks why we are so often fixated on fixation, why we often seem so stuck on stabilization, and what it is that both stabilization and destabilization do for this or that corpus, whether martial or social or both, whether in here or out there. Dankeschön.
Also einen riesen Dank an Paul Bowman, Professor Paul Bowman für den Vortrag. Wir werden direkt schließen mit Fragen zum Vortrag. Fragen am besten in Englisch. Wenn es lieber in Deutsch ist, können wir auch übersetzen. Ich würde die Fragenrunde eröffnen. Moment, ich komme.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks for the keynote and the lecture. I try to make sense of some things that are going through my head or the discourse or whatever. You said you don't want to rush to definitions because of, so I heard it from you that definitions are in the danger of missing something, missing the ideological context, missing political questions like the Taekwondo statue maybe. And I have to look there. I just need a bit. Okay. You said you don't want to rush to definitions, but also you are not against reality, empiricism, and so on, but not for an incompetent empiricism. My question would be if you, could it explain a little bit more what kind of empiricism you have in mind? Is it your last question, why stabilize things or why stabilize discourse in that way? Or is it maybe like Ben Heimer wrote this year in his book Culture, when habits broke down, when culture broke down, we found culture that matters. Could you explain a little bit more about the differences between incompetent empiricism and the empiricism you maybe have in mind?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, first of all, my argument came out as a polemic, and as part of the polemic, that involves a caricature. So I construct a caricature of a naive kind of empirical approach, because I've once or twice I've kind of written about other people's work and really pulled it to pieces and deconstructed it and shown how and it just left me feeling really bad, because I don't want to wreak havoc, I don't want to do violence to an emerging field that I value and that I think is really crucial. So I have quite deliberately avoided critiquing anyone else's work, because what I want to do with the polemic is not to say, I don't want to cause a battle. What I want to do is to make people reflect on the nature of the orientations of their work. And I think that it's important nowadays to insist on the value of theory as a way not of just being clever, but of enabling you to conceptualize relations differently, to see something more and other and differently and perhaps better than you could have done without the theory. So I could make a polemic against theory as well, because theory often leads people to more theory. So you get some studies of martial arts that would use, like, say, Deleuze, right? And they look at martial arts films and martial arts culture and go, so you see this is a rhizome, and you see this is deterritorialization, and you see this as a nomad. And you go, yeah, okay, so? I don't care. That's just making of something, that's making it Deleuzian. But I think that theory at its best enables us to reconfigure And it's like putting a different lens on a microscope. So you look at something under a microscope and you put a lens on it and you go, this is the lens of Marxism. Okay, I can see class here, I can see antagonism. This is the lens of feminism. This is the lens of queer theory. This is the lens of... and this is what theory should be. It should enable us to illuminate and to kind of reconfigure the way we think about the world. So yes, I will not give an example of naive empiricism. It possibly doesn't exist anymore. We still get some incredibly bad things submitted to the journal, which I don't want to talk about because, we're the gatekeepers and we say, no, sorry, this is too naive, this empiricism.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I've got two short questions. First question, what is, or is there a theoretical difference between defining and indicating? And the second, how do you manage the paradox of your program, the identity of differences?
Is there a difference between definition and indication? Well, I think when I hear indication, I start to hear kind of Peircean semiotics, and the kind of indexicality, the kind of the indicating of something. And I think there is, I think there probably is, because in a sense, the second question relates to the first question in terms of I think that academic discourses are enabling, but also there's a cost. There's a limitation to them. So this is why the subtitle of my last year's book was Disrupting Disciplinary Boundaries, because I think that too many people go through university and they come out the end disciplined, and so they can't see that the way they do it isn't the only or necessary or essential way. So I want to really get front and center the question of the interdisciplinarity and the interdisciplinary possibilities of martial arts studies. So, and when it comes to managing differences, I think that, I always think that Derrida had a point. He said that, the thing that we need to strive against ethically, politically, and conceptually is refusing the collapsing of difference into opposition. So I think the world is multiple and contradictory anyway. And so I think that an academic discourse should be able to deal with that contradictoriness. So if I want to talk about Tai Chi, then I'll have to be very clear about what I'm talking. I'm talking about my experience of it. I'm talking about the books I've read about it, the films I've seen of it. There's a risk that I'm proposing a unitary kind of Platonic form Tai Chi that resides somewhere. We do this all the time. Whenever we say martial arts, we think there's one. Or if we say Taekwondo, we think there's one, but there's several, obvious. I could talk about this for a long time. But when you use a term, it seems to confer an identity on it. But within that, it conceals the differences within it. So in answer to your first question, yes, I do see a difference, and I would prefer indication to definition. And the second question, managing, I think that what I'm trying to manage is our paradoxical or our fraught relationship with our disciplines. And I often see an analogical kind of connection between academic disciplinarity and martial arts disciplinarity, and the drive for anti or interdisciplinarity that emerged through the late 60s and 70s. You see that in martial arts. You see it with Jeet Kune Do and let's be more interdisciplinary. And you also see it in academia. Through the 60s and 70s, you see why are we only looking at things this way? What about, why are we looking at things in terms of literary theory? Why don't we look in terms of sociology? And there's a historical connection between this paradoxical, no, I keep using paradoxical, this fraught relationship with disciplinarity, and I think that's really quite an interesting thing. So I haven't answered your question, which I think is appropriate given the answer I want to give.
Yeah, I appreciate very much your approach, and I saw that you used, most of your approaches have used the linguistic turn for the analysis of the how to define a thing or how to put it in distinction between two different aspects. I have the feeling that if there's another approach, it's a quite analytical philosophy, also mostly from the other side of the ocean, and there are continental approaches which should do the job if you're not trying to define a thing, but try to tell what it is not, to make any, what's the negative side of it. And I have the feeling that there might be quite some stuff which can help without putting a definition, without working with a Platonic idea, and quite in the thought of having a substance and things, but of how it grows or how it's seen and how the feminine is shown up to. Have you done anything in this direction yet?
I'm starting. I'm learning. I mean, I grew up in post-structuralism. You know, that's where I start from. And what comes natural to me is deconstruction.
I see.
And so someone says something, and I can just pull it to pieces. But all of the other, I mean, I'm much more. This is why, when I came up with the title, and when I started to think about writing this, I really genuinely thought I was going to be writing much more about Ben Spatz's book, which is about embodiment and embodied knowledge and technique as knowledge. But in the space of writing it, I realized that I wanted to make a kind of polemic first. And I wanted to do that for strategic reasons, probably mainly because in the English language context, especially around physical education and the points at which people who are writing about kind of martial science, I guess, you know, and physical education, it's still it strikes me as not theoretical enough. But then, on the other hand, the stuff I haven't mentioned, the stuff that is around theatre and performance and kind of embodied knowledge, is much more sophisticated. But I feel I was already trying to do too many things. Maybe next year or the year after, this is where I will be, because this is I think important for us to move into this.
Maybe I add a thought to that. There's a huge difference which language you choose for the approach with the discourses you're using, and if you taking the English discourse, as you told, it's your native approach. I think it's fixed on those kind of analytical or linguistic analysis, and on the other hand, for other theories, prefer another language. I think there might be hidden something.
Yeah. I mean, I've just undertaken some research. I've started to try and research all of the kind of literature within the field of psychology, however defined, normally by whatever turns up in a library search, to see how psychology as a discipline has been engaging with martial art in different ways. Because I've spent a lot of time in kind of history and film studies and cultural studies, and I'm very interested in seeing how the sciences actually have. Because obviously, you know, it's that paradoxical situation where you kind of critique something, I'm not doing science. I'm not doing science. That's so limited and blinkered, but you haven't actually read any. You know, so this is where I want to go next. Yeah. Too long I've been kind of slagging off something without really knowing enough about it, so I want to try not to do that too much.
Eine Frage 6.
Thank you very much, Paul. Practical question. On our banner there, we have the 4 points that our commission is our agenda that we want to fulfill, and one is public communication of the research fields, and one is advisory and expertise also for the public requests or maybe other parts of university or so on. So within the field, yes, we have to deconstruct. Yeah. But when you communicate with the outside world, what do you do then, or what would you propose? So when the newspaper comes, so Mr. Paul Bowman, you're the expert on martial arts. What is martial arts? Well, do you try to transfer this openness then, or do you discuss differently with them?
Yeah, I would say more or less the same thing. I would shy away from terms like articulation, contingency, and structural dislocation and so on. But I think that you can talk about plurality and you know, you can talk about this this very easily. The way in which you can use a term, you think it means one thing, but it meant something very differently in China, it's meant something very different in Hong Kong, and it means something different in North America, then it means something different in Britain or Germany, and you can talk about the changes, you know. So you can do all that before you define. I mean, I think that the definition stuff, that mode of address is a very academic one. You know, I think that if you get interviewed for a newspaper or something and you go, I define martial arts as these criteria, but I have these structural possibilities of exceptions and so on and so on, I think people go, okay, I'm not reading that article. You know, the journalist just paraphrases it anyway. But I think if you start talking about, well, it was very different in China, and then it becomes something different in America, and then it becomes something different, I think that kind of discursive, conversational, it's almost like it's pre-analytical or pre-scientific, but the way you talk about it reflects the nature of the way you conceptualize the object anyway. So the notion of discourse that I grew up with and that my PhD was all about is the one which says you can't scientifically, absolutely, you can't like apodeictically, however you want to pronounce it. You can't do these things. You can only do that in logical games. You can only do that in the language games of academic disciplines. The world has different language games, and part of that language games is the movement of history itself. So I would be happier if it was public communication to just talk about it the way that I want to talk about it anyway, without the quotes from Derrida, Leclau, Zizek, all the rest of it. Do you disagree?